Wow, so this has been about a 1.5 year process. This is a 1986 200 4R GM 4-speed overdrive transmission that originally came in this car. If you remember, however, though, it has a manual transmission. This transmission did live for a short time behind, well, what that was replaced by, which is a turbo 4.1 Buick V6. So 85, 84, all the way up to 87, Grand Nationals got the 200 4R 4-speed overdrive. Whether you go with a 700 R4 or a 200 4R, they're both 4-speed autos. I guess the only really benefit, there's many benefits to a 200 versus the 700. One of them being that the 200 has Buick Olds Pontiac bell housing. It's in the trash bag here, where the 700 allows you to have a 4-wheel drive. 200 doesn't. Beyond that, the gear ratios on a 200 are more similar, better fit for car-based stuff, because a 700 was more designed to have a 4.3 liter powered like Blazer S10 square body Suburban pulling a boat out of a boat ramp. So it's anemic power, heavy load, big tires. You know, they have a very high numerically or low ratio first gear. So you got that really bad first gear split, unless you spend a ton of money to upgrade the first gear planetary. The 200 also is awesome because it has the exact same front bolt pattern from where it goes to the engine to the rear flange that Turbo 400s do. And they are a little bit more robust. However, the 700s and 4L60s have a lot more support, I would say. The dilemma, in my opinion, that I found with a 200 is that they only came in GM G bodies, so Monte Carlo, Regal, Grand Prix, and Cutlasses from 83 to 87, and then they came in some Cadillacs starting in 81. Then there was also some B bodies like Caprices up to 88. So kind of the problem you run into here is these transmissions stopped production in 88, 89-ish. There's a ton of different variations. I think the thing I struggled with more than anything is you can get any 200 R4 and it's going to be almost always different than another 200 R4 when you look at the calibration. Where if you get like a Turbo 400, people don't care with a few exceptions. You got some thicker cases, you got some different bolt pump counts, you have some different counts as far as sprags, the 34 versus the 18 or 16 or something. Anyways, but 480Es went all the way up to production until like 2012 or something. So there's tons of parts for 80Es to go in 400s. Everybody in their random trans shop can build you a 400. Similar with an 80E these days now, but these things are specialized, and I didn't really understand that getting into this. I mean, the fact of the matter is the 200 4R is the right transmission behind a carbureted or simple EFI, like a pre-OBD2 setup. Or if you're under like 600 horsepower, it's going to have way less rotating mass. It's going to fit better. The problem is it is a specialty transmission. There's not that many people that know these. Part stock is challenging, and the valve body calibration on these matter. Where a 200 Turbo 400, it doesn't matter if it came in a Chevelle SS or a clapped out snowplowed truck with an anemic small block from like 82. It's this, nobody cares, but these care. GM did a lot of different tweaks throughout the years on these. So basically, believe it or not, This is $2,000 of parts. That hurt. I thought this was going to be like less than half that price. I'm looking at like $2,300 to rebuild this transmission, which I had a really hard time grasping early on. And it's not that where I went is really any more expensive than anywhere else. It's just inflation has been brutal on these from what I gather. It's specialty. And like I say, there's essentially CK Performance, Dave Husek, which are both in New York. There's Extreme Automatics in Ohio, I think. There's a couple other guys. There's Art Car. There's a lot of specialty shops, but you take one of these to a non-200 4R specialist, from what I gather, and you're kind of rolling the dice. Where if you bring a Turbo 400 or Turbo 350 or 4L60E to any of those places, chances are they're going to get it right the first time. So, well, getting past the cost, that was a challenge. The other challenge is, what parts did I want to put in this thing? The dilemma that I encountered is there's a lot of billet aftermarket parts, but I wanted to be cost conscious and kind of balance reasonable performance expectations to reasonable cost to something that's going to hold up to, 400 horsepower, 10 PSI or whatever in a 4.1 Buick V6. So what I had basically was a 80,000-ish mile trans that was kind of hot. And what I say kind of hot means you look at the clutches, there's some brown, you have some hot spots. Again, some hot spots. Couple hot spots. Nothing was melted, but this transmission would not go into second gear. And the fact that it's an overdrive is a little bit more complicated, but it's actually pretty simple when you break down what the clutches are. Basically, each clutch has a gear. So you're looking at, I'm going to start from reverse. This is reverse and forward. That sits in the way back of the transmission. That engages or disengages to select forward or reverse. Then you've got this drum assembly here, which is actually packaged up here. But that drum mounts between this rear half and the front half. Basically, there's first gear, so if that's engaged, you're in neutral or first, which stays on the whole time you're in drive, first, third, whatever. And second gear, this is your second gear clutch, is your band, which rides on here. Your third gear, or your direct, sits in there, and your overdrive sits here. Now you're looking, why do I have a clutch pack here? That's your overrun, that's your coast clutch, which is why you got the sprag here. So basically, if you're back feeding power in, that's what provides your engine braking. From my gathering, all my forward load carrying clutches had some heat in them, except the only ones that didn't were the reverse and the overrun, or the coast clutch. So took it apart, and a couple other little wear issues. Check your washers, thrust washers, seals, stuff like that. This is the focus. You can see there's some wear on the stator. That goes into the torque converter. That's an aftermarket piece, hardened, that you can get to Sonax for $40 to $80, depending where you find it. And what I'm looking at here is, what did I need to do based on, obviously, the simple stuff, and then a couple cleanup issues, like this drum. There's some seal rings that mate onto the center support. There's some slight grooves, so I need to clean those up. The other updates were doing some repair on this drum. You can see there's some wear on these ears, which interface into this. This is an upgrade part, this rear drum, that they'll try to sell you, but I was told that this is actually only upgraded from GM on later model transmissions, so like 83 or 84 later on, and they're all hardened. If you send yours in as a core and they claim it's gonna get hardened, they're just gonna throw it out, take the core charge, and send you back one that's a later model that is hardened. So if you got an 84-ish or later, just keep your drum because it's already hardened from GM. But I was told you can take a TIG or a MIG, build those corners back up, grind them smooth, file them smooth, where this rear drum and the front drum become a nice mate and you don't have as much slop. So now that I kind of cover, you know, the base maintenance related stuff and kind of what the kit is, well, what does the kit actually get? Well, first I got a more heavy duty drum. Like I say, that drum has first and direct right here. And the reason I went with an aftermarket drum is because the factory ones all have this fillet underneath the spline. And that cracks under higher power applications. This is an art car drum. I was a little bit more cost conscious. Aftermarket ones, they take this tube off and it's called a billet. Yes, it's billet, but they just reuse everything. They take this chunk, throw it away. They make a new replacement that's hobbed instead of spline rolled. So this is spline rolled where it goes on the machine, and you have to have this fillet because it goes through a giant like rack that rolls back and it creates that spline. Art Car anneals and hardens these, so it is better. It's not as good as a from scratch quote unquote billet one, but it's under half the cost. And for my power level, I was trying to be conscious. I didn't want to just dump money into it for stuff I'm probably not going to need since this is a lower application horsepower. So I was a bit more cost conscious there. When I say $2,000, that BR Turbo Buick valve body, the governor, and that drum accounted for about half that price because I didn't have the high performance part to have the drum, to have the valve body or the governor. The drum is like $225 or so. Everything else like the clutches, the seal, like the seals, the pump parts, some other upgrade parts here. Husek looked at some of my governors and did some reconditioning on them. New torque converter lockup solenoids, some springs to make my non-performance 200R a higher performance focused one, and the band and all that stuff. All the normal updates, if you already have a decent transmission, is going to be under $1,000. That valve body and governor were big price killers, but that's just what I dealt with because if you're familiar with the 8.5 Turbo Buick rear ends that are like $1,200 to $1,800, or Grand Nationals or T-Types or Hearsts, you know, the 442s, that rear end is valuable. So are the transmissions because they got special stuff in them. The run-of-the-mill 200s that don't have the super high performance parts, you can put them in, but you're going to pay. But if you can't source a high performance 200R, there isn't a ton of options. So, like I said, that drum, I went with the hardened one. Valve body, Husek basically swears by Turbo Buick valve bodies for Turbo Buicks. I am paying him to put it together, or a kit together for me. I couldn't really argue. That's what it was. Governor, same. I had experience with cutting the factory governor down. If you can actually see, this is like a grinding mark. I took the factory 305 CA valve body governor and just cut it down to an image that I found online. Husek said it doesn't work. This doesn't work as well as you think it does. I didn't understand why, but looking at the actual Grand National governor that he provided me, the spring is different. So there is some different stuff in there. Like I said, the kit, basically a factory rebuild kit. He does provide a heavy-duty direct clutch. He says that the direct, or like third gear, is the weak point. He has his heavy-duty parts. I'll get into that later a little bit. Also, I'm going with a 3-disc friction overdrive. This is a factory overdrive, and you can see there's a friction here, a steel, a friction, a steel, a steel, a friction, and a steel. GM decided for, I think, heat reasons, from what I understand, none of these ever had big power really, is to put less frictions than technically they could have. Basically, everybody goes through and puts an additional friction in, which is 80 thou thick. This is the piston, which basically mounts in the center support facing forward. And that part you throw in your lathe, if you're like me, or you just buy one that's already cut, but you just cut 80 thou off this lip. And that allows you to put the third clutch in. And Sonax parts, the heavy duty servo, that's my stock one. This is my Sonax one. Basically what you do here is the bigger the area, force is equal to pressure times area. You turn your pressure up a little bit. You turn your area up a lot. As you can see, that's big, that's not as big. This is like the Sonax Super Servo. That is what allows or requires, or whatever you want to use the word, but that ups the pressure that second gear pushes on the band, which stops that drum from spinning and makes you go into second gear. So Husek has his own band that he has designed. It's carbon clutch versus like the wide one. I've heard the wide one's not really in production anymore. That's just what I got. So I'm gonna have a big project ahead of me. There's a lot of little nuances that he was telling me about that are in here that I'm gonna try to cover a little bit. Things such as he has his own custom spring for the accumulator that keeps the accumulator for, geez, what is that accumulator again? Something else I found really helpful is to print out the ATSG manual. And I think that's a 3-4 accumulator. So the 3-4 accumulator, you want to keep your accumulators working when you crank the pressure up if you don't swap that spring out. Sonax does, I think, offer it. I think this is one of Husek's custom ones. It could be, I could be wrong. It might be a Sonax part, but he just buys it by the barrel. So you replace that. The pump parts, that's his, some Sonax stuff you can get. Husek offered that to me. He's got a billet apply ring for direct, and then he's got a spring, a 16 spring apply plate for direct, where my low performance version, you can see it's missing springs. So he has that as a replacement part. He also has offered one of the things he said, there's a billet anchor pin for the band right there. And there's this little spring here. It's actually to kind of split the difference between, this is the band release spring. This is the carryover spring from the original valve bot, or the original servo that I had. When you buy the Sonax kit, you're basically just gonna toss these out. There is a spring delete kit. Don't delete that if it's street car. This is a super heavy spring because Sonax apparently wants to release really fast. This is the factory CA one out of the Grand Prix 2+2 trans. It's soft. And there's a middle one that Husek supplied because he said, that's the bomb.com. So, like I say, I got a big project. Spent a lot of money here. Learned a lot. I also sent him my separator plate, and he did his own valve body recalibration on it. He's just not a fan of the Transco stuff, and you tell him what you're doing, and he just builds a shift kit with it to be more reasonable from a mid-performance setup versus super high performance. So, like I say, it hurt to spend $2,000 on this. I like to be very cost conscious and that is not cost conscious. However, looking at what you get for a kit, you know, all the seals and the clutches, you're going to pay anywhere between $250 and $500 for the clutches, the seals, the thrust washer, stuff like that. If you buy a Sonax servo and a stator, those are just sunk costs. You got to do whoever you source it through. The valve body, Voodoo, that Husek did for me, if you're lucky enough to get a valve body, you're going to save yourself like $500. I don't know where to buy Grand National transmissions that aren't hooped, so I just had to buy one from him that he has on stock. Same with the Governor. All the Sonax or Husek or whoever you get them from pump parts for pressure regulator and stuff. Again, update parts to make your low performance trans like a high performance trans. The kits typically don't offer your lockup solenoid, which they recommend to replace. The generic kits aren't going to offer stuff like the springs. You're going to have to buy it separate. So yeah, that $1,000-ish for the kit minus my upgrade parts, you know, the stuff I didn't really have, sounds crazy. But when you actually look at what you'd spend on a generic like Transgo shift kit, plus some Sonax parts that Husek has here, plus sourcing things like the things that typically aren't involved in the kit, like the lockup solenoids and all that other stuff, you do get really close to that, like $1,000. So just want to be clear of, yeah, it's expensive, but you're kind of pigeonholed. You're doing the hot rod thing. It sucks, but that's what the unfortunate reality is these days. So this is part one. I'm probably just going to edit this video, post it, and I'll do part two where I'm actually doing some stuff later. So this was my first auto. I've done tractor transmissions professionally for a couple of years. I did manuals in this thing last year. I've done lathe transmissions, never done an auto. So why not do one of the more complicated, expensive ones to build, right? Yeah. Okay, catch you in the next one.